So hello everybody, thanks for coming along today. Hello also to the online audience. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Adrian Ely. I'm a lecturer at SPRU, Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex, but I also work very closely with colleagues at IDS, including those to my right. What we have today for you is a panel discussion around the issues related to the July IDS Bulletin, which is on China and international development. Distinguished panel of 4 speakers who I will introduce in turn, who will each talk for 5 or 10 minutes about the bulletin and about their contributions to it, after which we'd like to open up to some discussion involving people here in IDS and also people online. So anyone who's watching online who would like to ask questions, you can direct them to the hashtag on Twitter, IDS China, and one of our colleagues will collect them up and relay them to our panel, who will then provide you with the answer you request. But without further ado, what I'd like to do first is to hand over to Jing Gu, who is the convener of the Institute for Development Studies Rising Powers in International Development program, with a lot of work on international development and international relations, and especially with the influence of China over a number of years. Jing.
Thank you. Thank you, Adrian, for the wonderful introduction. This issue of the IDS Bulletin focusing on China's development strategy and how it is influencing the country's engagement in other low and middle income countries, as well as its collaboration with traditional donors like OECD DAC members in international development. The aim of the issue is to contribute to dialogue between decision makers, policy analysis, and researchers in China, UK, and the other countries about strategies for supporting international development. This issue is an output of the IDS Rising Powers in International Development program. IDS Rising Power program is a partnership between policy analysis in the UK and the Rising Powers. In recent years, China is becoming increasingly vital for international development in 4 ways. First, China's own domestic experience holds lessons for other countries. For example, the role of state and markets in promoting growth and reducing poverty, the design and delivery of affordable services, and managing the social and environmental costs of rapid growth. The second is China's engagement with low and middle income countries. As trading partner, investor, or producer has direct implications for the development path of these countries. And this is particularly apparent in the massive expansion of China's activity in Africa, but applies equal to Mekong region and Latin America, etc. So such direct engagement provides a driver of growth for such economies, as well as an alternative model of development. So is there a China model of development? It's subject to debate. And the third is China is a potential source of global public goods that are particularly relevant for the developing world. For example, in technology development, in the energy and the health sector, etc. And it plays an increasingly influential role in setting international norms and standards that affect global development. So the last point is China is emerging as an increasingly important agent of development cooperations, but one that does not conform to the OECD norms. And perhaps, my colleagues will elaborate on this point later on. So without further ado, I will hand over to my colleague Kerry, who will explain why we produce this special issue on China and the international development.
All right. Well, I guess as Jing already said, essentially the engagement of Chinese firms and the Chinese government in many low and middle income countries is substantial and growing rapidly. And this is, one way or another, disrupting ways of managing the development enterprise that were established over decades in the post-colonial period. So I guess the big question is, how can actors from low-income countries, from China, and the members of OECD develop and negotiate new rules of engagement that ensure that economic growth and development that is used is sustainable and benefits the poor? This is one of the big global challenges over the next decade or two. Our thought in our program and in the bulletin is to say that one step towards this objective would be to build mutual understanding about the core challenges of the development enterprise and what's more likely to work well. One big challenge we will need to overcome in building this understanding is the legacy of only minimal communication between the development communities in what used to be called the West and in China, due to issues of language, politics, and culture. And I just wanted to say a couple things about that and where the bulletin might contribute. China is developing rapidly, and this is generating a large body of experience within China. Its policy analysts are overwhelmed already with engaging in providing support to government with implementation of rapid change. And they now also have to develop good ideas for their engagement in the rest of the world. So why IDS? IDS is actually quite well placed to facilitate this kind of meeting of minds that would be necessary for mutual understanding. We have a long history of work and research in collaboration with government officials and researchers in many countries during the post-colonial period. The design of the building, less this room, but certainly other rooms, reflects our origin as a source of training for senior civil servants from many of these countries during the immediate post-colonial period. Our researchers have been engaged in many of the debates about the development process and the problems that have emerged in the engagement by OECD countries in this process. And although our researchers have tended to take a critical approach and have written critiques of the development enterprise, we've still mutually, with the agencies and with those involved in the development enterprise, co-constructed the language and the framework within which we understand it. So we are very much part of the post-colonial development enterprise. And we also have a history of collaboration with Chinese scholars in researching development in that country. Now, I think one thing that many people aren't aware of is that over the past couple of decades, the Chinese government has invested in what is by far the largest development program probably ever in the world. The Western China Development Program covered an area and population equivalent to several of the largest countries. It was a major effort which involved government officials, researchers, and many rapidly growing private companies. As China has become increasingly engaged in other countries, those who were involved in Western China are inevitably influenced by the experience they had. And there's relatively little knowledge outside China of the lessons that have been learned, what worked, what didn't work, what problems have arisen, how have these experiences influenced understanding of development challenges. So within China, not only was there an enormous effort in supporting government and developing the intellectual tools for managing rapid change, but also an enormous concentration on the Western China development. And that is an important part of global knowledge that really is mostly not yet being communicated beyond China. One way to begin to build mutual understanding is to exchange lessons learned from these experiences, and that's what the bulletin is partly about. There's little systematic knowledge available to non-Chinese audiences about the experiences gained in Western China. And as China explores the applicability of its own development experience to other countries, its development community can learn from the experience of other countries about the challenges of adapting approaches that work in one place and adapting them to another context. So there's really room for mutual learning. The bulletin, the soon-to-be-published bulletin on China's engagement, is an exciting endeavor and provides an excellent platform on which we can continue to build mutual learning. It's important to note that the editing was shared by senior policy analysts in China as well as researchers from IDS. And the authors are from China, from the UK, from Argentina, and from a number of other countries. So it represents some international thinking about this big challenge. It illustrates the kinds of partnerships IDS is establishing to play an effective role in supporting the construction of a global community of development analysts. And I think it's as the start of a long process that we should view the bulletin. Yeah.
Thank you, Jing and Jerry, colleagues from IDS. Now it's my pleasure to introduce some visitors. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Richard Kerry. He's been a trustee of IDS, so he's no stranger to the institution, but he's also a member of the Advisory Council for the IDS Rising Powers in International Development Programme, and was also former Director of Development Cooperation at the OECD. He's currently also on the International Advisory Committee of the China International Development Research Network. Richard, he's going to be talking about his contribution to the bulletin.
Thank you, Adrian, and very pleased to be here as part of this venture. I think the bulletin will make a big contribution to understanding the enormous changes that China is bringing to the international development scene. Now, the subject I'm going to talk about today is China's development finance. And the article that I've written with my co-author, Jiajang Zhu, who's a young Chinese DPhil student at Oxford who's researching the governance of the World Bank since 1960 and coming up with some very new angles on that subject. Our essay is focused on what are the issues for reporting and monitoring systems of China's development finance. Because as Jerry said, China's coming onto a scene where all the governance structures were built by the West, the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD. So there are established reporting and monitoring systems, and China hasn't been part of that. Question is, to what extent will China join these monitoring and reporting systems, and what's the state of play on that? That's what our article is about. Now, there are three major issues I want to build our discussion around today. The first one is the scope of China's development finance. The second one is China's evolving global stakes and interests in effective states and financial integrity. And the third one looks at current global reporting and monitoring systems and their evolution and China's participation. So let's go back to this whole question of the scope of China's development finance, and that's a macroeconomic story and an institutional story. It's macroeconomic first because China has emerged as a very, very large structural capital exporter. And the origins of that are in the international monetary system. This is the story of Ronald McKinnon, who has been looking at this across 50 years, but is looking still at the coalface right now. And what you see is a US dollar system that has allowed the United States to reduce its national savings rate and run large external and internal deficits. And that means, as we all know, that globally, somewhere there has to be a corresponding surplus. And this big international surplus has emerged in China for a number of reasons, demographic, very fast growth, the particular financial infrastructure in China, etc., that has caused this big savings surplus. So there is now $4 trillion of foreign reserves that China manages. And the question is what to do with these reserves. Now, a large lump of them are in US Treasury bonds. But what's a country to do to invest these surplus reserves in productive investments that will produce income flows over the next decades for China, which will eventually have a diminishing labor force, etc. So we know about classic capital exporting countries from the past. The UK was one of them. And therefore, there is this question of how to transform them into productive investments. And there's a whole story about how to relocate China's foreign reserves, and a Chinese economist called Chao Yu has written recently on that big subject. So let's bring us to the institutional side, because to invest these reserves, you need institutions to do it, who know how to invest and put money to work in various areas. Now, Justin Lin and Yang Wang have written a piece just recently trying to classify these various capital exports into 4 categories. Development Finance 1, DF1 is the ODA, aid-like flows. Development Finance 2 is more like the Export-Import Bank flows, that other official flows in DAC language. Development Finance 3 is the finance coming from big Chinese commercial banks, which are state-owned, basically, but they operate like commercial banks. And then Development Finance 4 is foreign direct investment, a lot of it coming from state-owned enterprises. And then China has multinational enterprises owned privately. But then there are a lot of small Chinese investors, and Jinggu has written the seminal work on that, and there are sovereign wealth funds. So these are the institutions through which this large amount of money is going out into the world, not just to developing countries, but a very significant portion of it to developing countries. Now, the particular fact about this kind of organization is that state guarantees, implicit or explicit, are a very big factor in this form of financing, and that enables the Chinese institutions to go places and take risks and have time horizons that aren't available to most of the institutions in the West. And there is also what Zhao Junzu and I call a form of public entrepreneurship involved. The institutions, they have these long time frames, they have visions, they have capacity to act because they have the money and they have the public guarantees, and they have very innovative approaches, they can do things fast, etc. So that's what's really the special characteristic of Chinese finance that's being recognized in news stories and etc. around the world, and they relate to the structural exporter issue, which is a global macroeconomic issue. Now, coming to the second part of this presentation, China's evolving global stakes and interests in effective states and financial integrity. If you're a structural capital exporter and you are looking for returns to come over the decades ahead, you have a very big interest in a well-functioning global economy. You have a big interest in the effectiveness of the states in which you are investing. And you have a very big interest in financial integrity. That is to say that the money doesn't get wasted, that it doesn't get taken and put into Swiss bank accounts or whatever, that the debt doesn't explode in your face and you end up in a big mess. China wouldn't want to be at the middle of a debt crisis in Africa, for example. So what does this mean? That China has, as it's become a bigger part of the system, has the sense that it's going to have to take more responsibility for the system. And I think in China there is this view that China will have to provide more public goods in the future to the management of the world economy, have to take more responsibility because bigger interest. It's built resource supply chains with a lot of this money, with these long-term timeframes. It has to be interested in state fragility. State fragility is now a problem that can't be swept aside. And you have a great interest in development effectiveness, that the countries in which you're invested actually make development progress, that there isn't going to be, there aren't going to be a succession of political crises that make it difficult to operate in such countries, and that these countries are going to pay you back in dividends or interest or whatever. And so we see China looking to improve the international system, but not through the existing institutions so much as new institutions. So right now we're on the cusp of the creation of the so-called BRICS Bank, probably in Fortaleza in a couple of weeks' time. Sounds like it might be based in Shanghai. There's a new Asian International Infrastructure Bank, which is also at a very advanced stage. We have the China-Africa relationship and a big speech by Li Keqiang, the Chinese Prime Minister, in Addis last month, saying in the next 50 years, China's modernization and Africa's modernization will go together, and we will work together in that time frame. And then finally, on the debt sustainability front, China has challenged the World Bank and the IMF on this part of their governance system, because after the financial crisis and after the big debt reduction programs in which OECD countries had invested a lot of money, there was a borrowing space in which China went quite rapidly into filling with infrastructure loans, etc. And China argued that this was transformative infrastructure lending that would generate growth, that would generate the repayments. And it challenged this thinking in the G20 and changed the language. So the World Bank and the IMF now use the language of transformative infrastructure when they have their debt discipline, which is the non-commercial borrowing policy of the World Bank and the IMF. And of course, they have to confront the problem. If you need so much money for infrastructure investment over the next decades, and everybody agrees that you do need trillions and trillions, how do you reconcile that with a very strict limit on commercial lending to developing countries? So that's something China's taken a position on. Finally, let me come to what is actually the real subject of our paper, and we spend most of the time of the paper on looking at individual parts of the global reporting and monitoring systems. First of all, there's the reporting system on ODA, which is a very contested system at the moment, and it's being renovated. The big argument in the OECD DAC on what to count as ODA and not, particularly regarding loans. And China, on the other hand, has gradually beginning to put together aid statistics. And we've just had an announcement that they will put together a system for reporting their aid efforts. But we have two different concepts. The DAC concept built around altruism, giving money and not expecting any return, and the Chinese and the South-South philosophy built on mutual interests, so that you give money, but there are it's a mutual interest and there will be returns, and that is fine. Then there's the export credit disciplines. There were export credit wars among OECD countries in the 1980s, which produced crass competition. I mean, a lot of taxpayer money was being put into buying export markets, basically. China wasn't involved in that stage. It wasn't in that game at all. Now it is in the world of competitive selling of exports. And it is beginning to participate a little bit in the export credits regime, particularly on one subject, which is shipbuilding. But whether it will join a broader export credits discipline is a big question. Then there's South-South development cooperation, and here in the UN there is an ambition to build a system of statistics on South-South cooperation and a system of norms and best practices. That's coming up in the UN in the next few months. We've already had a little look at that in the Mexico City meeting of the Global Partnership, and we have friends who are involved in this endeavour. Remains to be seen whether South-South can indeed make a system of definitions and measurements that is viable and people in the South can agree on. Then there's the question of tax evasion and illicit flows, big international issues. They've come onto the agenda of the G20. A lot of work in the OECD as well on this, and China is participating in this work. It's part of the global tax network to exchange information flows, and it's very much involved in corruption issues. And then finally, there's the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, where companies declare how much they've been paid by governments, and governments declare how much they receive, and these are supposed to match just to ensure that the money hasn't gone somewhere else, to Geneva in particular. Now, Chinese companies have not been keen to be in this system, but in the United States, the Dodd-Frank legislation requires companies registered in the US to participate. Now, Chinese companies who are registered on the New York Stock Exchange will have to come and show that they are part of this system. But beyond that, it's a question of the reputation of Chinese companies, and if Chinese companies want to take over another big multinational enterprise, for example, in the mining sector, and there's a public hearing or a public debate, then the evidence that Chinese companies are being part of an international governance system in mineral revenues, etc., will be germane. So that's the picture that we paint. It's a very big picture. We don't know what is the scale of Chinese development finance because the numbers aren't there, but we think that Chinese interests now are to produce more numbers, to have transparency, not only for other people in the system to judge whether the system is stable and sustainable or not, but also for their own management of their own development finance flows. Thank you.
Richard, thanks very much. Really fascinating contribution to the bulletin, one of 10 really interesting pieces written, as colleagues said, by contributors from China, Europe and around the world. Another contributor sitting to my right is Professor Li Xiaoyun, who is the Dean of the School of Humanities and Development at the China Agricultural University. Also has been involved in this work and is chair of the China International Development Research Network. And he's going to talk a bit about that and other issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I would let me just begin by sharing with you the issue of what I call recent time, the knowledge production, because we feel sometimes in China that the development knowledge has been very much, from our angle, Eurocentric, that we feel are not relevant when we just turn those things, those kind of understanding and perspective to the Chinese conditions. For instance, when we have issue of participation, and we have the knowledge about gender relation. Jennifer, gender relation. Look at the gender and the development. All those knowledge, and of course, those knowledge has been produced with the interaction with the developing countries. It's not produced in-house in IDS or somewhere. But the primary framework and the cosmology to end up those kind of terms, concepts, largely we consider largely Eurocentric. And therefore, when we have the new age of talking about the rise of China, as Jim and Kerry and Richard was talking about China, and we face again the problem as we faced before, that what language we could use to have dialogue, because very often you find the Chinese official discourse is very much self-defensive. Oh, China is best, we're not colonialist, we're not making trouble, this kind of I call it political self-defensive, which is not helpful, because and we feel ourselves very often that we are having a dialogue with unequal condition, because political self-defensive discourse cannot have dialogue with well-established intellectual knowledge. Therefore, and when we look at the issue, that if we assume China has actually produced kind of alternative, not really in the sense of a final solution, but alternative way for many developing countries. And then the question for us is that how are we going to articulate, how are we going to postulate this kind of proposition, sometimes politically or sometimes intellectually, to have dialogue with what I call inclusive development theory on the institutional changing based development agenda, which is well elaborated, well developed, and widely practiced by the bilateral, multilateral, even NGOs, and in Africa, in Asia, or even in China. So, therefore, and we have started among Chinese scholars a few years ago, who are interested in the issue. We are not special. We don't have this specialization. What Kerry said, this kind of development enterprises, which you produce knowledge here, you produce the individual expert professionals carries this kind of missions, carry this concept, learned from RDS inside the house of gender participation. Robert Champs, were doing this to African. We don't have these kind of enterprises. We don't understand this. Therefore, we don't need to reproduce similar enterprises. But we need really looking this kind of intellectual exchange in the similar way that you understand, not political self-defensive. Now, China is not neo-colonialist, and it doesn't make any sense. Therefore, and the professors from different fields in China, from international relations, from development studies, from social sciences, various areas agreed to make up kind of informal. It's not organization, but informal network. And to form this network, to be a sort of platform that we could have a dialogue with international expert politicians and with Chinese expert, with Chinese politicians. So I think Alex, you spoke last year the public event, and Melissa spoke this year, previous one public event. So we had a kind of a platform that created to allow us to to have exchange. It was a very interesting exchange how the Chinese scholar are looking at the issue where last event when the Tim Allen was talking about health issues, how the health categories produce, all these kind of anthropological perspective of development in the health sector. And a Chinese expert usually debate of Chinese for aid and Chinese and international development is very much under international relation perspective, which is looking very structurally, dichotomy of China and other issues, very geopolitical perspective. And then the Chinese scholar would find very interesting and how the area of anthropology, political science, economy, sociologists look at development, and it's very interesting. So that is the one aim of the network the network is going to provide this kind of opportunity that different stakeholders will come together to share what I call knowledge, and not directly looking debate of policy, which is a bit ambitious. You don't have any evidence-based thinking. You're going to talk about the kind of policy, which is. But we talk about this kind of understanding. Second issue is that we try. It's not easy because it's not organization. You can't see we build capacity things. It's very difficult. But at least the network is interested to support kind of evidence-based field-based research, and we found that in China empirical-based evidence-based research is really, really lacking, and therefore we launched the research grant and Rich Kerry, and he's been very helpful to organize our international advisory committee. We had people like David Morse, we had people James Fulkerson, we had people various people level to help us to formulate kind of a research agenda and to encourage young scholars, member of the network, go into the field and look at the kind of political economy analysis of the Chinese engagement with Africans, with for aid, as well as kind of ethnographic study, where they would looking more in-depth information. I would not call it scientific study, but I would call it first step of kind of fairness-based kind of information generation. You need to generate information from the field. And then how to analyze this, how to articulate, postulate any ideas subject to capacity, because it's very lacking this field, we don't have very strong institute like many of your universities in UK doing this. So these are things which now to say to institutionalize this knowledge generation, and we would consider will contribute to the debate that China and international development, because this will provide our own language. Otherwise, it's very difficult for us to use this aid effectiveness, like ownership, in-country system, and all this very film, very, very difficult for us to translate into Chinese word, Chinese context, Chinese meanings. That doesn't make any sense for China. What does it mean, the ownership? Chinese people will say, this is the project, this is Tanzania's project. What does it mean, ownership? They ask us for this, and we give them. They ask for the Nyerere conference center. They want to have the conference. Many people come. We give the center. What does it mean, ownership? They are owned by these people. And if they cannot do it, they cannot provide, they cannot operate. That's their own problem. Why you call this ownership? So we don't have this system, and we have to often explain to Chinese officials to say, look, the Western people, and of course, they have this mutual accountability. And they are not entirely subject to any requirement. When you do the project, you go for the social assessment, you go for the accountability assessment. Eventually, you give something which maybe Tanzania or African doesn't need this. And therefore, you have faced this problem called sustainability and ownership. We don't have. So you have to spend such a long time to explain what Richard, you created this word in OECD Doc. This kind of ownership, harmonization, and everything. And we have often to do this. Therefore, we need to create kind of a bridge, knowledge bridge, that China and the rest of the world could really communicate. It's not an easy job, and we're not really ambitious, but we are aiming to share this with with IDS. We're part of this global network here, working very closely, and I hope we will be able to contribute more when this experience is coming, how this kind of rising power could produce in rising new knowledge. I'm not going to talk new knowledge, or different knowledge, and different terms, and I hope China would contribute different terms, which lastly I would like to see Richard, we have in our blog, we see when the Li Keqiang, he went to African, and he defined these 6 programs with a framework, which I consider personally as the first systematic politically and developmental, very politically, very different from previous kind of focal conference like friendship-based. It reflects strongly the neutral benefit against this kind of intrinsic institutional building Western agenda. So now China defined this political agenda to African, and it's up to African to digest, to analyze, to accept, to work with China, and also Li Keqiang calls for encourage third-party participation into this program, and this object to the OECD DAC members, the Western cabs, to see, look, are we going to join China? I would say that is the real battlefield, and before China was forced to come, and we don't understand language, it's very difficult. All this kind of communique, Mexico City, and Busan document is language, English language for Chinese. My English is not good, but many people even worse than my English language, and I could understand what that means. It's complicated. They're hiding a lot of things, message behind, and therefore today China say we open, okay, very simple. We're going to big airline companies and high-speed train African. We're going to support African industrialization. We're going to support African transformation. So that's up to you. So therefore, lastly, I would say the China International Development Research Network would really look at that kind of process to try to understand what is things behind and how we're going to react, and we're going to articulate that we could have kind of intellectual exchange and sharing with our intellectual partners. Thank you very much.
Xiaoyun, thank you, and thanks to all of our panel before we go to questions. So now we do have a few minutes for questions. We're going to need to use the microphone, so if you do have one, please put your hand up, and I'll pass you the microphone so that you can actually speak it and the people who are watching online can hear. Okay, and we have a question from Twitter.
So Adam Pickering from the Charities Aid Foundation asks, what part should Chinese philanthropy play, and could domestic giving culture create demand for more focused foreign aid?
Thank you. Xiaoyun. What is...
What part should Chinese philanthropy play, so domestic philanthropists and domestic charity, and how can this create demand for more focused foreign aid?
This is open to the whole panel. The role of philanthropy, Chinese philanthropy.
Yeah, in the international for aid, right? Okay, and I think this is very controversial in China because and somebody said, well, the spirit of this charity tradition is not really in China, is not yet there, and the current practice of this charity way by China, but most of Chinese entrepreneurs with a very strong utilitarian function. You know, it's not really based on the charitable spirit. And secondly, and there's really has been increasing tendency of contributions from this sector, and this recognized for a number of private foundations now looking in international direction. They have started to contribute to health service sector in Sudan, to contribute for hospitals, and increasingly they organized a forum in China recent months to discuss how they would contribute to Africa's development. And also I was in Latin America, and I was very surprised to see the contributions from the business sector in development. Huge programs running under the scope of social responsibility. Therefore, I would see that is the area where I would see firmly the most potential area where China would make contribution in the future in the different ways in the development. Yeah.
Thanks. And is there anyone else on the panel who'd like to address that question?
Yes, just one point. There is a now very large Chinese diaspora in Africa, and diaspora that's been in other parts of the world for a long time. And as wealthy people emerge in that diaspora, I think it would be a very natural and constructive thing that they would put money back into the countries in which they have put together their wealth. And I think that would be, it would indeed, as the questioner is looking for, create some very interesting avenues for assistance. But it would also, I think, help with China's own standing internationally as a developmentally oriented country. Thank you.
I'm tempted to make a comment. Because I said that it's important to look at what happened in China when you look at what's being offered globally. And what happened in China is the fastest pace of economic development ever, over 20 or 30 years. And then what we've heard from Richard is, out of nowhere, very, very large pools of investment capital are developed. And what we heard from Xiaoyun is not a menu for slow, gradual change in Africa, but an offer of transformational infrastructure investment, which is an application of what happened in Western China to Africa. So although it's a good question about philanthropy, it's worth keeping in mind the size of the offer that's being made and the underlying assumption of very rapid economic growth. Now, we don't know if that's going to happen, but I think that it's very important to recognize the difference in the offer that's being made and what that means.
I'll just add, it's a very interesting question. In terms of the role of Chinese business in China's foreign development assistance, but the old saying is, God helps those who help themselves. So the China's domestic experience shows the Chinese do not believe in charity. So it's not, for example, the China-Africa relationship, it's a strategic partner relationship. So it's not a donor-recipient relationship. So to some extent, it shows the Chinese belief. Business is business, and politics is politics.
Thank you very much. Interesting question and interesting answers. We've got three people from the floor who are going to ask questions. I suggest that you each ask them in turn, 1, 2, 3, and if you could please say who you are in advance. Thanks.
Hello. I'm Merle Lipton, and I'm a member of the Advisory Council. I'm also a researcher at King's College, London. I would like more clarity on the differences between the Western and the Chinese model of development cooperation. We were hearing quite a bit about, at one time it was said there was no conditionality at all. But now we hear that the Chinese are concerned about, quite understandably of course, rule of law, that the development assistance or investment should fulfill its intended purpose and not be siphoned off into corruption and property rights and so on. So are they converging, these two systems? And if they are, is this debate really not about the substance so much, but as who controls, about power and control? And that, of course, brings us to the question of how much the Bretton Woods institutions, how much progress is being made with reforming them. And we know that the United States, I mean, this is something on which Richard Kerry probably is well informed. Are we making progress there? Is it the United States Congress which is the main obstacle? It's odd. What is Western thinking on this? Why don't they want to be accommodationist and reform? Do they feel they'd rather keep control of their institutions and have an alternative set evolving? So that is the question I'd like to ask, focused mainly on development cooperation and financial institutions. Might I just raise the question of what's happening in the area of trade? Is this an area on which the BRICS and the emerging powers are getting the act together, so to speak, to act in a coordinated fashion? Because there are very big issues coming up here with regional agreements being reached. Is there a BRICS position or emerging powers position on the Doha round and on these regional trade agreements that are emerging?
Thank you. Roger Williamson. I'm a visiting fellow here at Institute of Development Studies. I was very interested. I've spent a week in Vietnam recently and at a UN conference, and two of the specialists who interested me particularly, I was conducting interviews with them. One was Justin Yu-Fu Lin with the New Structural Economics, and I wanted to know how typical his views are for the intellectual elite within China, because it seemed to me he presents a very compelling case that basically China has developed a new model of industrial development, but not falling into the trap of a comparative advantage defying economics. And that actually the route to development for African countries is to follow the same approach. And that approach is outlined much more in detail by a book by Hin Din, Tales from the Development Frontier, how China and other countries harness light manufacturing to create jobs and prosperity, basically saying that, really in line with what Justin Yu-Fu Lin is arguing, that many of the jobs in light manufacturing could actually, in the course of the next 20 years, be taken up by the African economies. And the key thing there is removing the restraints, infrastructure restraints, etc. And that seems to me to fit completely with the analysis that the panel are presenting. And under light manufacturing, it's industries such as apparel, shoemaking, leatherwork, woodwork, light metalworking, and that is the approach. Now, the other thing that I found really fascinating, when I interviewed Justin Yu-Fu Lin, he argued that on his projections, China is going to have another 20 years of 8% growth. I checked this with some of the other Chinese experts, and they said, no, that's optimistic. Perhaps it's only going to be 7.
My name is Ricardo Santos. I'm a PhD student here at IDS. And first of all, I would like to congratulate this initiative, this bulletin. And for me, it's really refreshing. It's really very interesting and very important when you're talking about international development. that this bulletin doesn't fall in the schizophrenia that I see so many times when it's all about aid and all about aid agencies and all about NGOs. We're actually talking about the role of China in all that China is doing in international development, and that entails business, that entails trade, that entails investment, that entails working relations, that entails personal relations, and not only actually the things that we already mentioned were not talked about. Philanthropists, aid, NGOs, those were not talked about actually in all of this, and I found it very, very, very interesting. Another thing that I would very much value is the notion of language and the language barriers. I'm Portuguese speaking, and if I go to Portugal and I talk about development in Portugal, we're talking about a very few number of countries, but very big richness of dialogue that's being conducted in Portuguese. And yes, most of those words, ownership and all of them, you actually have to say it in English, because if you are to translate it in Portuguese, it's also difficult. One of the things that I've noticed here at IDS and in general is how the language it actually shapes which countries of interest we're talking about. And I think there's a very interesting opportunity now that China is opening a platform for knowledge sharing to bring Francophonie also into the dialogue, to bring the French-speaking research also into dialogue. I think would be a very interesting opportunity that China has, because like traditional research pools tend not to be that open to multiple languages. Since you know already the barriers, it's an opportunity. One risk, though, that I noticed in some of the things that are being said, and I'm looking very much into a set of countries, one of which Timor-Leste, so fragile countries that more than any other country are said to do the right thing and believed not to be able to find out what's the right thing to do by themselves. They're very much described like that. And one of the things that I've listened, and might be misunderstanding from me, is this idea, we want to share our development path. We did this well, we want to share this and see if people want to pick that up. It's not that different from what Hoover said in the 1950s when he started all this whole development thing. So is that what you're trying to do, or is there another way of actually finding together that there are many different ways of solving very, very specific problems that each country faces?
Thank you. Some really interesting questions there. Clarity over differences between Western and Chinese models of international development cooperation, whether they're converging, issues of power and control, also trade and whether the BRICS has or the emerging powers have a position. Light manufacturing as a component of a development path and whether that is a good model proposed by some Chinese commentators for African countries. And also issues around language and also about the risks of sharing a development path pioneered by China. I'd like to start with Richard, and then I'm going to ask the panel to respond in turn.
Thanks, Adrian. Well, let me start with Merle's question on Western and Chinese model of development cooperation. Now, Li Chaoyun and I have written recently a discussion paper about the BRICS and the international development system, but the subtitle is Challenge and Convergence, so that we can have at the same time this challenge process going on while there is a convergence process also going on. And when it comes to models of development cooperation, certainly China is more and more interested in development and effectiveness, in evaluation processes, etc. And when the BRICS Bank is put together and made into a working institution, then a lot of those functions that such a bank has to perform, they will learn from other banks, as well as from their own banks, China Development Bank and other banks from Brazil and so forth. But there will be this concern with the effectiveness agenda. So that's a place where things will converge. But on the question of power, then the signs are right now that the challenge process is what is moving forward. And there was a very interesting article in The Economist this week, a leading article in The Economist this week, because it's 70 years since the original meeting at Bretton Woods. And what this article said is that a big opportunity has been missed to bring the BRICS into the governance system of the World Bank and the IMF in the way that would need to happen if they were to feel real ownership in these systems. And so that's why we're getting the BRICS Bank. That's why we're getting a monetary facility put in place by the BRICS. That's why we're getting the new Asian International Infrastructure Bank, etc. And the whole BRICS Summit enterprise, as Li Xiaoyun and I described in our paper, which was an initiative, by the way, of the Russians, is to have a group that is looking ahead to a new structure of the world economy, which we will definitely have, I mean, demographically and wealth-wise, etc., and new governance systems in that global economy. So, Merle, I think this is a very important issue that you've raised there. On trade, the BRICS position is that Doha should be completed, and the BRICS are not involved in these new regional programs. And some say, indeed, that these new regional programs are designed to exclude China, and that China will have then to apply for membership of them. So there is also a challenge function going on here. It's a response, I think, to the BRICS position. Some would say the BRICS have been the obstacle in moving forward on Doha, so the Western countries are going around in a side movement. So there's a conflictual potential there. So those are the two questions that I would answer. Maybe Chao Yun could answer on the question of Justin Lin and where his thinking stands in relation to other models and other Chinese thinking.
Well, I want to respond to your question. My experience in working with China is that they don't actually think in terms of models, and so it may be the wrong question. And I wanted to make a couple points about that. One of our senior international associates, Zhang Xulan, basically did a review of the Chinese health reform and how it was managing in a very complex environment. And I think very much concluded that there was an iterative process between broad aims, experimentation locally, changing guidelines, so that it's a continuous process of development. And I wanted to share something from my experience in going for 10 years to a number of counties in Western China. And that is early on in a project that I was involved with health. I mean, the lead organization in essentially the Western China development was the Development and Reform Commission, which was essentially a standard investment arm of the government. And its thoughts were totally around building infrastructure. I was in health, very uninterested in soft things like service delivery or institutions, and focused almost entirely on trying to build institutions that would generate a return. But over time, there was a political process between that agency and ministries of health and ministries of social affairs, all the other players in developing a poor area, and more complex arrangements were put in place. And so I think and that was done iteratively and learning, and it's continuing. So what started as essentially a major infrastructure investment program then gets translated into programs around poverty alleviation, around environment, around service delivery. So I think we had a discussion here last week where someone from one of the big development banks was talking about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Fund, and also was voicing the worry that it will simply be building infrastructure with no views about sustainability, no views about environment. And what I was hearing is exactly the same process that happened in Western China. And if we're talking about, I don't think we're talking about a model, but the question I think we're really asking is how quickly can Chinese institutions learn as consequences emerge? I guess the thing about convergence, I mean, my sense of what's happening is we're in a major disruption. Who is going to converge towards whom, and what we're going to converge towards is very much up in the air and is unclear. I think the least likely is that we're going to converge towards the institutions built in the 1960s and 70s. I think we will get, well, assuming we don't have severe violence or war, we will be converging towards something. It'll be a negotiated convergence, and we don't know what it is, and I would expect we will have more of the management of complexity and rapid learning by all parties than we will have a debate between models.
Thanks for so many interesting questions. I will start with the major difference between Western aid and the Chinese development assistance. In my view, the major difference is the perception and the perspective. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the Chinese do not regard its relationship with African countries and also the other countries as a donor-recipient relationship. They regard it as a strategic partnership. So the emphasis is mutual benefit and the win-win strategy. Of course, win-win doesn't mean you win equally. Some win more, some win less, that's life. So we need to recognize that. Yeah. Secondly, of course, there are major differences in its approach to development assistance, etc. So is there a break position on the Doha agenda? I don't think so. There's no break position on the Doha agenda. In fact, taking China as an example, China has a very complicated national interest. So sometimes it shares the common interest with some developed countries. But then in some cases, it shares interests with the other big developing countries. So it's very difficult, even for itself, to have a unified strategy, let alone a break position. So there's no, break position on the Doha agenda or on the WTO negotiations. And my last point is about the bulletin. Ricardo asked a very interesting question: is this bulletin about sharing experience? Yes, the question is yes and no. On the one hand, this bulletin is not just about to share its successful experience, but more about a lesson need to be learned. So it's a two sides of a coin. So it's not just about a positive or successful experience, but also about those negative experiences that need to be shared and learned among all the developing countries. Thank you.
I think I would first share with Male issue of no conditionalities, because and I would see in two areas, two concerns. One is that Your argument was a bit in the situation of intention and outcome. Intention and output. When China certainly like stability, political stability, and social stability, and good governance, no corruption. Nobody like corruption. I don't think China would like corruption in Africa, no. In that sense, when the Western agenda, development agenda can really build kind of a corruption-free institution, and China's involvement with Africa would be marvelous. So from that perspective, of course, you see the kind of political convergence, and that's, I don't think that kind of conflict, but the problem is not in that level. The problem is the intention, substantive intention level. Because China, when you ask China, oh, look, you have huge economic interest in Africa, so you should join us for peace building, for political agenda, everything. So, and that sounds very, very reasonable, very justifiable. But the Chinese say, no, we can't do it. This is very self-contradictory. Why? Because China feels that and it has no capacity, practically, to go into this kind of complex process of intervening institutionally. For instance, we don't have experts sitting in the Ministry of Finance to review African countries' financial budget. We don't have this capacity. This requires really capacity, to do it. Practically, we don't have this one. Even, how you could send a vast of English-speaking personal expert going to this kind of institutional building process is difficult, practically. Secondly, of course, we could build up this capacity over the next 30 years. But secondly, secondly, and China, by cosmology, would consider that China has no cultural foundation to change others. This is the building the relationship between China and others, and the perception on others is very different from this kind of colonial-based process, which you view others, and the British view others, the American view others. It's other, how to see from the right beginning of the process of colonialization and the post-colonial, you produce special knowledge, special ways dealing with others. So we don't have this tradition. Therefore, I would say for the Chinese leaders, consider to changing any country's regime in the sense of good governance defined by us, which is good or bad. I think China doesn't have this kind of framework, culturally, socially. I would say, therefore, China would see no conditionality. This would mean we take this social gift, and utilitarianly we see the mutual benefit, mutual interest. Mutual interest means we don't give things free. We expect something from that exchange, which we feel everybody will get equal. Otherwise, altruistically, if you deliver the gift free, and you build up power yourself, you're powerful automatically when you give something to poor people without having anything back. And then you build up an equal relationship already. Therefore, Chinese historically would see equal means, I give you something which you give me some return. This kind of way, and everybody feel equal. You don't owe me anything. I would say that conditionality comes from that kind of belief, and then China say, well, conditionality does not mean we don't like you have good system. That's different issues, as you guys mentioned that, and I would say, secondly, and as Kerry said, and whether China model things is very difficult to articulate China model, but I would combine your question, looking at Justin's new structuralist economics, and is essentially that China's development is the learning process, first. It's not designed transformation, no. And what Deng Xiaoping said, we just cross river by touching the stone. So, and it's not pre-designed the path that you're going to tailor, you're going to do it, no. It's the learning. and they can stop anytime. What Kerry said, health program, and they would restart again, And this is the learning. Therefore, what you said, what Jesselyn trying to see, what Jesselyn has been debating with more normative development idea, in the sense of it's end of history, and there's nothing you could argue that neoliberal and the liberal democracy institution is essential for sustained inclusive prosperity of any developing country. So that is something guiding the debate. What Justin said, no, this doesn't make sense, because African countries do not need necessarily to create soft political environment and then to absorb FDI to start industrialization. No, he said no. And African can start as what he did in Ethiopia, that you could start and with a kind of industry park by working with a committed state, which Ethiopia, former prime minister, is committed, and he convinced him, and the prime minister went to China, and he convinced him, and the prime minister went to China, and talked to the Chinese private business people, and moved the company, shoemaking company, to Ethiopia, with 2-3 years, and now they hired this year 7,000 workers, and he said, look, and if you could do one piece by one piece of this work, eventually you will start really industrialization from this learning process, and you create demand to solve the problem. You create capacity to learn how to solve this problem. This is what he's trying to see, the relationship between the industrialization in Africa and institutional building in Africa. But he did not reject, he did not deny completely the value of institutional building and the capacity, but he says take reality. You cannot have that situation. You cannot create good environment, good political situation and governance and start this one. This is too normative. This is what he was trying to say this. Of course, his argument does not have kind of foundation from normative institution, neoliberal economic theory. You can't find this, because there's nowhere you could see you have corrupted state and everything, and you would build our economy. So nowhere. But what he said is that China did not start this kind of institutional reform, rather to reform institution along with the learning process, piece by piece. This is what he's trying to see, and he's trying to debate with his World Bank's colleagues and with many people in the West. That's what you have said. And basically, I would say, well, let us take this two approach. What Muller asked, whether exists kind of China model, West model. I said, China, you cannot say China has the really model. But if you take if you take time from 1949, not just take 30 years, 1949, and I would just like give you a number of data. Let us just discuss a little bit of this. It's very interesting. 1978, by 1978, China has already built up the irrigation system, and the irrigation coverage already reached to 50% of all urban land in 1975. So this means. Secondly, by 1970s, China already fully established the agro-industry system, like producing fertilizer, producing tractors, everything already there, And by 1970s, and the rural road, everything is not high expressway, everything today, but it's paved way, and all the infrastructure there. So by taking 1949 to today, this is almost more than 60 years. So take that 60 years time to looking for number of indicators, the social indicators, looking for the health, looking for the education, any indicators measured by the UN, looking for this, all these social indicators, social development indicators, and looking for the economic indicator. Disregarding the environment, pollution, everybody talk about. Let's talk traditionally, these two actors. And these 60 years, China has completely changed. But this change does not follow pre-designed institutional changing pathway. That's why Jesslyn began to argue that you don't have to. And of course, it's good if you could create. It's good. That's why we see he's still neoliberal economist this way, but he take very practical thinking, looking for Chinese experiences. And I don't think that he's really tries to articulate in the theoretical manner, but he tried to create kind of practical way to help African. And he's been very busy, and I really support him because he's been working very busy recent years after he left the World Bank for African issues. So I just and lastly, for your question, it's not a linguistic language. It's knowledge behind, because you don't understand that. What does it mean this ownership? As I said, it's owned by Tanzania. What doesn't mean this? This is the knowledge, understanding, and development is complex set of ideology and power things. That's why we need. I'm not going to a very extreme way to produce what Chinese knowledge. I don't like that word, but I'm going to say, look, we need to create kind of a local-based understanding, which we could explain to our own people what does it mean this theoretically, as well as we're going to have the dialogue with you intellectually to see that is not neoliberal, that is something different. And then we say, different. This is the learning. Otherwise, we always go for debate, defensive, always kind of angry or feeling is not very good. So this is the way we, the intellectual should face in this process. Many people should come in to study this. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I think that's a fantastic place to end. So thank you very much to all of you for coming along, for those of you watching, and also thank you very much indeed to all of our panelists.